The Strait of Malacca stretched endlessly beneath a sky void of the moon, its vast waters absorbing every whisper of wind. This was one of the busiest maritime trade routes in the world, yet tonight there was an unnatural stillness to it. Aboard the Silver Star, an American merchant vessel, the night watch was quiet. Too quiet. The men moved through their routines mechanically, checking cargo, adjusting the ship's heading, and occasionally glancing at the horizon, expecting movement but finding none. It was a night like any other, until the radio static changed. Deep in the radio room, Second Officer Daniel Abbott lazily adjusted the dials of the transmitter, one hand propping up his head as his eyes grew heavy with boredom. His other hand toyed absent-mindedly with a half-burned cigarette, the ember barely flickering. The Silver Star was in open water, and communication had been uneventful for days. Then it happened. The static shifted, morphing into something unnatural. A strange, whining pulse crept through the speakers, distant and warbled, like a whisper trying to break through from another world. Abbott sat up straight, removing his headphones for a moment, his heart picking up pace. He tapped the side of the receiver, adjusting the frequency, expecting it to be nothing more than interference. But then, a voice broke through. It wasn't the usual curt tone of a captain issuing coordinates. It wasn't a ship requesting docking clearance. It was a whisper, strained, barely above a breath. All officers, including the captain, are dead. Abbott's cigarette fell from his fingers, landing in a pile of crumpled notes. He snatched up a pen, scrambling to transcribe the message, his throat tightening. Lying in chart room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead. The words came in sharp, clipped bursts, like the sender was struggling to breathe, forcing the words out one by one. Abbott pressed the transmit button, his voice unsteady. "This is the Silver Star. Identify your vessel. Repeat, identify your vessel. Do you require assistance?" Static. He pressed harder. "State your position. Repeat, state your position." For several seconds, there was only the heavy hiss of dead air. Then, one final transmission came through. A whisper. A breath. Then silence. Abbott stared at the radio, feeling his own breath catch in his throat. The words seemed to cling to the walls of the cabin, lingering long after the sound had died out. The hairs on his arms stood on end. Something wasn't right. He hesitated for only a moment before launching himself toward the bridge, nearly colliding with a deckhand on his way up the iron stairwell. He pushed through the heavy doors, stepping onto the bridge where Captain James Turner and First Mate James Reeves stood, speaking in hushed tones over the navigation charts. "Sir?" Abbott's voice came out more frantic than he intended. Turner turned to face him, brows furrowed. "What is it, Abbott?" Abbott's hands were still trembling slightly as he unfolded his notes, reading back the transmission. When he finished, no one spoke. The dim orange glow of the navigation instruments cast eerie shadows across the bridge. The low hum of the ship's engines was the only sound, a steady reminder that they were still moving through open waters. First Mate Reeves exhaled slowly. "Jesus. Did they say who they were?" Turner's voice was calm, but his jaw was tight. Abbott shook his head. "Only gave one name. Ourang Medan." Turner exchanged a glance with Reeves, who rubbed the back of his neck uneasily. "That doesn't sound like a Navy ship," Reeves muttered. Turner nodded. "No, it doesn't." Abbott licked his lips. "Sir, there was something wrong with that voice. It didn't sound like panic. It sounded like resignation." That made Reeves frown. "You're saying they knew they were already dead?" Abbott didn't answer. Instead, a strange stillness settled over the room. Turner broke the silence first. His voice was sharp, decisive. "Do we have a position?" Abbott nodded. "Yes, sir, 50 nautical miles ahead." Turner pressed his lips together, thinking. The Strait of Malacca was dangerous, a known hotspot for pirates and smuggling operations. There was every possibility that this was some kind of trap, but something about the transmission unsettled him in a way he couldn't shake. He looked up. "Set course, we're going to find that ship." The Silver Star cut through the dark water, its engines humming beneath the deck. The ship had altered course, now heading toward the coordinates of the Ourang Medan. Though the captain had made his decision, the crew could feel the weight of something unnatural settling over them. The bridge remained silent after Turner gave the order. He stood at the helm, staring out at the endless sea, his thoughts clouded. Something about the message had struck him deeper than he wanted to admit. He had heard distress calls before. He had heard men cry for help, their voices shaking with desperation. But this was different. The voice on the radio had sounded empty. Reeves cleared his throat. "Sir, I still think this could be a trap." Turner didn't look at him. Pirates don't kill an entire crew and send a distress call just to lure us in. Reeves exhaled, crossing his arms. "Unless they want our ship too." Abbott, who had remained by the radio, shook his head. "No, I don't think this was an ambush. That voice, I don't think that was a man trying to trick us. I think that was someone who had already given up." Turner's grip on the wheel tightened. He didn't respond. Below deck, word of the transmission had already spread. The crew whispered among themselves, passing the story along like a ghost tale told by firelight. A young deckhand, barely 20 years old, leaned against the railing near the cargo hold. "I heard it was just one guy left, and he knew he was about to die," he muttered to the man beside him. His companion, an older sailor with deep lines carved into his weathered face, sighed. "I've been at sea for 30 years, he said. "Seen things I still can't explain. But a whole crew dropping dead at once? There ain't a storm in the world that does that." The young deckhand swallowed. "What do you think happened to them?" The old sailor looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes," he said, "the sea takes what it wants." A few feet away, 2 engineers sat on overturned crates, both smoking cigarettes in silence. One of them, a stocky man named Harris, finally spoke. "I don't like this," he muttered. "Everything about this feels wrong." His companion, a wiry man named Bellamy, exhaled smoke through his nose. "You're not the only one." Harris shook his head. "No, I mean, I really don't like this. I don't know why, but I feel like we shouldn't go looking for that ship." Bellamy smirked. "Well, good luck convincing the captain of that." Harris flicked his cigarette overboard. "Just saying. Feels like we're sailing straight into something we won't come back from." Back on the bridge, the wind had picked up, carrying with it a strange chill that didn't belong in the tropics. The sea was still unnaturally calm, but the air had changed. Turner didn't acknowledge it, but he felt it too. They were getting closer, and something was waiting for them. The Silver Star moved steadily through the dark waters, its bow cutting through the gentle waves with an eerie quiet. The air was still, but there was something different about it now, something that made the sailors glance at one another without speaking. The closer they got to the Ourang Medan's last known coordinates, the heavier the atmosphere became. The bridge was silent except for the rhythmic hum of the ship's engine. Captain Turner stood at the helm, his fingers resting lightly on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Reeves, arms crossed, stared at the black water ahead, his face unreadable. 15 minutes out, Abbott announced from the radio room. His voice sounded forced, as if speaking was the only thing keeping the weight off his chest. Turner gave a slow nod. Keep monitoring the frequency. Abbott didn't respond, only adjusting the dials, his fingers moving with a nervous energy. The crew below deck had gone quiet. There was no laughter, no casual conversation, just the occasional cough or the distant clang of tools. Even the sound of the ocean felt muted, like they were moving through something heavier than water. The young deckhand who had whispered about the distress call earlier now stood near the railing, gripping the edge with white knuckles. The old sailor beside him took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "You ever hear about the Flying Dutchman?" the old man asked. The deckhand swallowed. "The ghost ship, right?" The old man nodded. "A warning. Sailors who see it don't come back." The deckhand licked his lips. "You think that's what this is?" The old sailor didn't answer. Suddenly the lookout called from the crow's nest. "Ship spotted off the port bow." Every head turned toward the horizon. There it was, the Ourang Medan. It loomed in the distance, barely a silhouette against the dark sky. No lights, no movement, just a silent, lifeless shape, rocking with the slow rhythm of the sea. The bridge tensed. "Good God," Reeves muttered. Turner adjusted their course, bringing them in closer. The ship looked intact, at least from what they could see in the low light, but something about it felt wrong. Abbott tried the radio again. "Ourang Medan, this is the Silver Star. Do you read me?" Nothing, just the soft crackle of dead air. The closer they got, the worse it felt. The old sailor on deck let out a slow breath, as if bracing himself for something unseen. "There's no one alive on that ship," he said softly. No one disagreed. As the Silver Star neared the drifting vessel, Turner felt a strange, instinctual unease creep up his spine. He had seen plenty of abandoned ships before, derelicts left to the mercy of the ocean. But this wasn't the same. This ship hadn't been deserted. Something had left it that way. He turned to Reeves. "Prepare a boarding party." Reeves hesitated, just for a second. Then he nodded and moved toward the deck to gather the men. After the men were gathered, Reeves hesitated again. As the Silver Star pulled up alongside the Ourang Medan, the air around them felt heavy, pressing in on their lungs. The stench of salt and something else, something worse, drifted toward them. The deck was empty, no movement, no signs of life. Turner exhaled. "Let's find out what happened here." The boarding party climbed the ladder, stepping onto the ghost ship's deck. The moment their boots touched the wood, the temperature dropped. And then the first body was found. The wooden deck of the Ourang Medan groaned under their boots. The men moved carefully, stepping into the thick, unnatural silence that swallowed the ship whole. The wind had died completely. The only sound was the distant lapping of waves against the hull and the rhythmic creak of metal as the derelict vessel rocked gently in the current. Captain Turner remained on the Silver Star's deck, watching through his binoculars as First Mate Reeves led the boarding party across the deck of the Medan. The men had holstered revolvers at their sides, but something told them that no weapon would be of use against whatever had happened here. The air was thick, stale, wrong. Reeves motioned for the men to spread out, stepping toward the center of the deck. There was no sign of life, not a single voice, not even a flicker of movement. It was as if time itself had stopped on this ship. Then, one of the men gasped. They had found the first body. A sailor lay sprawled near the railing, his eyes wide open, his face twisted in an expression of unspeakable horror. His arms were curled toward his chest, as if he had been reaching for something in his final moments. His skin was unnaturally pale, his lips slightly parted. There were no wounds, no blood, no sign of struggle. Another man let out a sharp curse. More bodies were scattered across the deck. Every single one of them was frozen in terror. Their faces were all the same, mouths agape, eyes locked in a final, wordless scream. Reeves swallowed, his own breath feeling heavier in his chest. What the hell happened here? One of the men turned toward him, his voice unsteady. Sir? They don't look injured. They don't look like they fought back. Reeves took a slow step forward, examining their stiffened limbs, the way their hands had curled in on themselves, their joints locked in place. It was like something had killed them instantly, leaving their bodies frozen in those final, horrible moments. The wind picked up slightly, and for a moment, Reeves thought he heard a whisper. But there was no one alive on this ship. The team moved deeper into the ship, stepping over more lifeless bodies as they pushed toward the bridge. The stench of decay thickened as they entered the corridors. The narrow passageways were lined with more corpses, slumped against the walls or sprawled across the floor. There was no blood, no signs of disease or poisoning. Only that same look of terror, frozen on every single face. They found the captain in the chart room. He sat upright in his chair, his fingers curled around the handle of his revolver. But the gun had never been fired. His face was twisted in the same wide-eyed horror as the others. One of the crewmen shivered. If he was armed, why didn't he use it? Reeves didn't answer. There was no logical explanation. The ship's radio operator was slumped over his station. His hand still rested on the transmission key, as if he had died the moment he sent the distress call. Reeves reached out and pressed the switch. Static crackled over the speakers. Nothing else. One of the men scanned the charts pinned to the wall, flipping through the ship's logbook. The last entry was incomplete, as if the writer had abandoned it mid-sentence. Reeves exhaled. Something scared them to death. A cold shiver ran through him as he looked at the faces of the dead crew. What had they seen in those final moments? And more importantly, was it still here? The last place left to check was the engine room. The deeper they went into the ship, the more oppressive the air became. Their breath came in shorter gasps. The lantern light flickered. Then they reached the doors. The heavy steel doors had been forced open. From the inside, the edges were warped, almost as if they had been melted or bent outward by some unimaginable force. No one spoke. They stepped inside. The room was dark, but they could still see the bodies of the engineers slumped over control panels or crumpled on the floor. Their faces were twisted just like the others, their hands reaching out as if trying to escape something unseen. Then the air changed. The temperature dropped instantly, their breath visible in the sudden cold. And then something moved. A low groan echoed through the ship, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the walls. One of the men stumbled back. "We need to get out of here." Reeves took one last look at the twisted steel, the frozen corpses, and the dark corners of the engine room. His instincts screamed at him. Back to the deck. Now. They turned and ran. The moment their feet hit the deck, the air shifted again. A deep, unnatural rumbling vibrated through the ship. The men turned toward the hull just as flames erupted from the lower decks. "Move!" Reeves shouted. The team scrambled back onto the Silver Star's launch boat, shoving away from the Ourang Medan, just as the flames engulfed the ship. The fire spread unnaturally fast, consuming the vessel in seconds. Then, a massive explosion ripped through the hull. The boarding crew barely made it back as the Ourang Medan began to sink, flames still burning even as the water swallowed it whole. The Silver Star's crew watched in stunned silence as the ship disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only smoke and ash drifting in the air. It was over, but there would be no answers. Only the final words of the last man on board. "I'm dying." The Silver Star drifted in stunned silence, its crew still staring at the place where the Ourang Medan had been. The ocean was eerily calm again, as if it had swallowed the ship whole, leaving no trace of its existence. Captain James Turner stood on the bridge, his hands gripping the railing so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The burning wreck had sunk within minutes, disappearing beneath the waves as if it had never been there. He had seen ships sink before, but never like this. The men who had boarded the Ourang Medan sat on the deck of the launch boat, still catching their breath. Their faces were pale, their eyes distant. None of them spoke. First Mate James Reeves climbed aboard, his clothes still damp with sweat. He walked straight to Turner, his expression unreadable. "It's gone," he said quietly. Turner nodded. "Did you find anything?" Reeves hesitated before answering. "We found them. All dead. No wounds. No sign of a struggle." He exhaled sharply. It was like something took their souls and left their bodies behind. Turner met his gaze. "What happened in that engine room?" Reeves's eyes darkened. "Something was in there with us, Captain. I don't know what, but I felt it." He swallowed hard. "And I think it knew we were there." The words hung heavy in the air. Below deck, the crew whispered among themselves, exchanging theories in hushed voices. "It wasn't natural," one man muttered, shaking his head. "You saw their faces. You saw their hands. No man dies like that." Another crewman shuddered. "I swear I heard something out there just before the ship went up, like a groan, but not human." A young deckhand, still shaken from the explosion, spoke up. "If there were no wounds, no disease, what killed them?" No one had an answer. By the time the Silver Star reached its next port, rumors had already spread. Sailors and dock workers gathered to hear the crew's account, their faces lit by lanterns as the story was told again and again. Speculation ran wild. Some dismissed the entire story as fiction, calling it an exaggeration, a tale twisted by fear and the sea. But others, especially those who had spent their lives on the water, weren't so quick to dismiss it. A grizzled old captain listened in silence before finally speaking. "I heard a story once," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "During the war, the Japanese experimented with chemical weapons. Nerve gas, they called it. Stuff that could kill a man without leaving a mark." He paused, watching the men closely. Maybe that ship was carrying something it wasn't supposed to. The chemical cargo theory was one of the most widely accepted explanations. Some believed the Ourang Medan had been transporting potassium cyanide or nerve gas, possibly left over from World War II. A leak in the cargo hold could have released toxic fumes, suffocating the crew and leaving them frozen in their final moments of agony. But that didn't explain everything. Even if it was poison, Reeves muttered. "Why did we feel it too? Why did the ship explode the moment we stepped off?" Another sailor chimed in, "What about radiation?" The radiation theory suggested that the ship was carrying an experimental weapon, perhaps from a secret military project. The strange sensations, the unnatural cold, and the eerie static interference on the radio could have been side effects of exposure to something beyond human understanding. But others weren't convinced. "It was the sea," one sailor whispered. "Something from below, something we weren't meant to see." The supernatural theory was whispered in darker corners of the port. Some believed that the crew had stumbled upon something they shouldn't have, that they had witnessed something in the depths of the ocean, something that took them. Session in the water. Balancing things out, Castile muttered. Things the water keeps hidden. Things the water keeps hidden. Maybe they saw one. Turner overheard these conversations but never joined in. He didn't believe in ghost stories, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the sea had swallowed the truth along with the Ourang Medan. Years passed, but the story never faded. It became one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in maritime history. No official records of the Ourang Medan were ever found. No Dutch registry, no manifest, no proof that it had even existed. Some believed it had been erased, covered up by governments who knew more than they let on. Others claimed it had simply been a legend, a ghost story meant to frighten young sailors. But one fact remained. On that night in 1947, a real distress call was heard. A ship was found, bodies were discovered, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Somewhere beneath the black waves of the Strait of Malacca, the Ourang Medan had vanished, leaving only its final words behind. I die. Now, if you want more paranormal ghost ship stories, make sure to subscribe, and see you soon.